They rerouted their storm water straight onto my land. And for a while, I honestly thought I was losing my mind. Then one morning, I found the pipe, brand new concrete, sticking out like a loaded gun pointed right at my pasture. And that's when I realized this wasn't an accident. It was a decision. The kind of decision that assumes you won't fight back. I live just outside a small town called Millhaven, the kind of place where folks still wave from their trucks and nobody locks their barn doors unless they absolutely have to. My place isn't fancy, never was, just about 12 acres of mixed pasture and scrubland, with a weathered red barn that's older than I am and probably tougher too. I keep a few horses, nothing high-end, just good, steady animals, the kind that don't spook easy and don't ask for much except grass, water, and a little respect. That lower pasture of mine, it's always been the softest part of the land, dips just enough that rainwater settles there for a bit before soaking in, but it's never been a problem. My dad used to say that field had better drainage than half the county, and he worked that soil long before I took it over. Storms would come through, heavy ones too, and by the next day the ground would be firm again, like nothing ever happened. So when that week of rain rolled in, I didn't think much of it at first. Just another wet stretch, gray skies, the usual. But by day 3, it felt different. The kind of rain that doesn't fall, it just hangs in the air and keeps coming, steady and quiet like it's got nowhere else to be. By day 5, I noticed the horses staying closer to the higher ground, bunching up near the fence line like they knew something I didn't. And then came that morning. I stepped out with my coffee, boots barely laced, expecting mud, but not that. The entire lower pasture looked like it had been turned into a shallow lake overnight. Not just puddles. I'm talking ankle-deep water stretching across the field, slick with this thin rainbow sheen that told me right away something ugly was mixed in there. Bits of trash floating around, plastic wrappers, leaves clumped together in corners where the water had stalled. I remember just standing there for a second, staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Because rain alone doesn't do that. Not on my land. Not like that. The grass was already starting to yellow under the water, patches of it flattened like it had given up trying to breathe. And then I saw how close it was getting to the barn. That's when it stopped being confusing and started being a problem. I set my coffee down on the fence post and walked straight out into it, boots sinking into the soft mud underneath, water pushing against my ankles, cold and heavier than it should have been. It had that smell too, not just wet earth, but something chemical, something off. Like runoff from somewhere it didn't belong. I didn't need a degree to know that water had been somewhere else before it got to me. So I did what anyone would do. I started walking the perimeter, following the fence line, looking for anything that didn't fit. Took me about 10 minutes before I found it, tucked behind a stretch of overgrown brush where my land borders that new subdivision they'd been building over the past year. They called it Brookstone Ridge, which I always found funny, because there's no ridge and the only brook around there is whatever they decided to pipe in. Big houses, neat little lawns, HOA signs at every entrance like they're guarding something important. And right there, cutting through their clean, freshly poured retaining wall, was a concrete storm drain pipe, maybe 2 feet in diameter, angled just enough to shoot water straight down into my pasture like it had a purpose. Like it had a target. I walked up to it slowly, like it might explain itself if I got close enough. The edges were still sharp, new, no dirt buildup yet, nowhere. This thing hadn't been there long, and the ground around it was torn up, freshly disturbed, like they'd finished the job and didn't bother looking back. I crouched down, ran my hand along the inside of the pipe, still damp, still trickling even though the rain had eased up that morning. That's when it clicked. They didn't just let water flow downhill. They redirected it. Every drop from that entire subdivision, their streets, their roofs, their sidewalks, all of it had been funneled into that pipe and dumped straight onto my land. No warning, no conversation, no easement agreement, nothing. Just decided. I actually laughed, just once, because it felt so ridiculous I couldn't process it any other way. Like who does that? Who looks at someone else's property and thinks, yeah, we'll just use that. But the more I stood there, the less funny it got. Because suddenly all of it made sense. The volume of water, the trash, the oily sheen, that wasn't rain. That was runoff. That was their problem, becoming mine. I pulled out my phone, took pictures from every angle I could think of. Close-ups of the pipe, wide shots showing where it crossed the property line, the standing water in my field. Something in my gut told me I was going to need proof, and a lot of it. Then I stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and just looked back across my land. The horses were watching me from the higher ground, ears forward, like they were waiting to see what I'd do next. Yeah, I muttered, mostly to myself, I see it too. I gave the HOA the benefit of the doubt, at least for about an hour. Figured maybe it was some kind of mistake, maybe a contractor cut a corner, maybe nobody up there actually knew where that pipe ended. So I dug up the number for their property manager, a guy named Richard Halverson, and gave him a call. He picked up on the second ring, voice smooth, almost rehearsed. Brookstone Ridge Management, this is Richard. Yeah, I said, trying to keep my tone even. My name's Caleb Turner. I own the land just south of your development. I think there's been some kind of issue with your drainage system. There was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. Oh, he said, you mean the outflow pipe? Not a question. That's when I felt that first real shift inside my chest, like something tightening. Yeah, I said slowly. The pipe that's dumping water onto my property. Another pause, shorter this time. Well, he replied, that's standard design. The land naturally slopes in your direction, so runoff follows the path of least resistance. I actually pulled the phone away from my ear for a second, just to make sure I heard him right. Standard, I repeated, bringing it back. You ran a concrete pipe through your wall and aimed it at my pasture. It's compliant with general drainage principles, he said, still calm, still smooth, like he'd had this conversation before. The water has to go somewhere. I let out a slow breath, looked back at that flooded field. Yeah, I said, but not here. And that's where things stopped being polite. He didn't even hesitate. That's the part that stuck with me later, how quick he was to dismiss it, like he'd already decided what mattered and what didn't, and I wasn't anywhere on that list. Mr. Turner, he said, voice still carrying that same practiced calm. With all due respect, your property sits at a lower elevation. That makes it a natural drainage point. We didn't create the slope. I could feel my jaw tighten, not because I didn't understand what he was saying, but because of how cleanly he said it, like he'd turned a man-made problem into something that sounded like an act of God. You didn't create the slope, I said, but you did create that pipe. There was a slight shift in his tone then, not defensive, just firmer. The infrastructure was installed according to our development plan. Approved by who? I asked. Another pause. The appropriate channels. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a conversation where anything got fixed. It was going to be one of those situations where you either accept what's happening to you, or you make it stop. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back, stood there for a minute just listening to the quiet, the kind that settles in after a storm, but doesn't feel peaceful, more like everything's holding its breath. Then I called the county, got bounced through 3 departments before I reached someone who sounded like they'd been doing that job for 30 years and had long since stopped expecting anything to move quickly. I explained the situation, tried to keep it simple, concrete pipe, redirected runoff, property damage. The woman on the other end made a few typing sounds, asked for my address, then gave me the answer I already knew was coming. You can file a formal complaint, she said, and an inspector will be assigned. How long? I asked. Another pause, this one filled with paperwork. Hard to say. Could be a few weeks, possibly longer depending on backlog. I looked out at my pasture again, the water line creeping closer to the barn with every slow minute. Yeah, I said quietly. I don't have a few weeks. That afternoon, my neighbor Hank rolled up in his old diesel, the one that sounds like it's arguing with itself every time it starts. Hank's been next door for as long as I've lived here, retired contractor, the kind of guy who doesn't talk much unless he's got something worth saying. He leaned out the window, squinting at the field. That wasn't there last week, he said, nodding toward the water. Nope. I pointed toward the fence line. They ran a pipe through from the subdivision. Hank let out a low whistle, climbed out of the truck, boots hitting the mud with a wet slap. We walked over together, and when he saw the pipe, he just shook his head slowly. That's bold, he said. That's what I thought. He crouched down, looked inside, ran his hand along the edge just like I had earlier. Fresh, he muttered. Then he stood up, looked back toward the houses on the hill, all neat and lined up like they were posing for a brochure. They didn't ask, did they? It wasn't a question. Nope. Hank exhaled through his nose, that quiet kind of frustration that doesn't need words. So what are you going to do? He asked. I wish I could say I had a plan right then. But the truth is, I didn't. Not yet. I just knew I wasn't going to sit there and watch my land turn into their drainage ditch. County says file a complaint, I said, a little sharper than I meant to. Hank gave a small, humorless chuckle. Yeah, and maybe by Christmas they'll come take a look. We stood there for a moment, the two of us staring at that pipe like it was something alive. Then Hank said, almost casually, you know, water only goes where it's allowed to go. I glanced at him. What do you mean? He shrugged, kicked at the mud with his boot. You change the path, you change the problem. That sentence sat with me longer than I expected. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that water creeping closer, heard it sloshing against the barn walls, imagined it seeping through the wood, ruining feed, soaking everything it touched. I kept thinking about what Richard had said. The water has to go somewhere. And the more I turned that over in my head, the more it started to sound like an excuse, not a fact. Because yeah, water has to go somewhere, but it doesn't get to choose. People choose. And if they chose to send it to me, maybe I could choose not to accept it. By morning, I had something that wasn't quite a plan, but it was close enough. I called around, found a supplier about 20 miles out that could deliver clay-filled dirt, heavy stuff, the kind that doesn't let water pass through easy. Ordered 4 truckloads, which felt excessive when I said it out loud, but something in me didn't want to do this. If I was going to act, I was going to do it right. Hank showed up again just as the first truck rolled in, like he'd been expecting it. Didn't ask questions this time, just nodded once and said, where you want it. I pointed along the inside of my fence line, right where the slope dipped toward the barn. We build it here, I said, keep everything on their side. Hank cracked a small smile. Now you're talking. We spent the better part of that day moving dirt. His backhoe groaned and clanked like it had opinions about the whole situation, but it did the job. We packed that clay down tight, layer by layer, building up a berm about 2 feet high, maybe a little more in some spots, stretching along the fence like a quiet line in the sand. Sweat, mud, the smell of wet earth everywhere. It felt like real work, the kind that pushes everything else out of your head. But the real focus, the real target, was that pipe. By late afternoon, the berm was solid, not pretty, but strong. I walked along it, pressing my boot into the surface, testing it. It held. Then I went back to the house, grabbed a thick roll of plastic liner I'd been saving for another project, and hauled it out to the fence. Hank watched me unroll it, raising an eyebrow. You planning to waterproof something? Something like that, I said. We cut the liner to size, laid it over the mouth of the pipe, wrapping it tight around the edges so there was no easy way for water to slip through. Then we started stacking cinder blocks, one by one, building a half-circle wall around the opening, pressing them into the mud, sealing everything down. It wasn't fancy engineering, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to stop the flow. At one point, Hank leaned on the backhoe, looked at what we'd built, then looked at me. You know they're not going to like this. I wiped my hands on my jeans, glanced up toward the subdivision. They didn't ask if I'd like it either. By the time the sun started dropping, casting that long golden light across the field, the pipe was completely sealed. No gaps, no openings, nothing but a solid barrier where there used to be an exit. For the first time in days, I felt, not calm exactly, but settled, like I'd taken back something that mattered. That night, the sky darkened again. You could feel it coming before the first drop hit, that heavy stillness, the air thick with pressure. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the clouds roll in, thinking about everything I'd just done. There was a part of me, a small one, that wondered if I'd just made things worse. If maybe I should have waited, let the county handle it, done things the right way. But then I looked out at my pasture, still scarred from the last storm, and that doubt didn't last long. The rain started slow, then built. Within an hour, it was coming down hard, steady sheets of water hammering the roof, running off the gutters in thick streams. I grabbed a jacket, stepped out onto the porch, and just watched. Because this time, it wasn't my problem anymore. At first, nothing looked different. The rain hit the ground, soaked in where it could, pooled where it couldn't. But then, slowly, I started to see it. The water coming down from the direction of the subdivision, moving toward that fence line, reaching the berm, and stopping. Not flowing over, not pushing through, stopping, and then turning. I leaned forward slightly, heart beating a little faster than I expected, watching as that redirected flow began to shift, backing up toward the source. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a subtle change in direction, like a stream hesitating. But as the rain kept coming, harder now, more volume, more pressure, that hesitation turned into resistance. And resistance turned into reversal. Water started pooling on their side, and it kept rising. At first, it didn't look like much, just a wider patch of standing water near the edge of their property, something you could almost ignore if you didn't know what you were looking at. But I did. I stood there on my porch, rain tapping against the brim of my hat, watching that slow, steady build like someone filling a bathtub and forgetting to turn the faucet off. The berm held. That was the first thing I really noticed. All that clay we packed down, all that sweat and second-guessing, it didn't budge. The water came down hard, hit that barrier, and just stopped. No seepage, no weak spots, no slow trickle finding its way through. It was like the land itself had finally said, no, not this time. And with nowhere else to go, the water turned around. Now here's the thing about developments like Brookstone Ridge, everything is designed to look perfect. Clean lines, trimmed grass, walking paths that curve just enough to feel natural, even though nothing about it is. But underneath all that, it's still just land. And land remembers where water used to go. So when that runoff had nowhere to escape, it started reclaiming those old paths. I could see it happening in stages. First, the retention pond they'd built started swelling, water climbing higher than I'd ever seen it, pushing up against the edges like it was testing its limits. Then it spilled over, slow at first, creeping across the walking trail that circled it, then faster, spreading out across the lower parts of the subdivision. By the time the rain really kicked into full force, it wasn't creeping anymore. It was moving. From where I stood, I had a clear view of the back row of houses, the ones closest to the slope. Lights flicked on inside one by one, silhouettes moving behind windows, people noticing something wasn't right. A car pulled up fast, headlights cutting through the rain, tires sending up sprays as it stopped near the pond. Then came the first shout, faint from the distance, but sharp enough to carry. I didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone. Confusion, turning into panic. I leaned against the porch post, arms folded, not saying anything, just watching. Not smiling, not celebrating, just observing the consequence of a decision that had finally looped back to where it started. The water kept rising. It spilled over the edge of the tennis courts next, those bright green surfaces they'd probably advertised as a selling point, now half covered in murky runoff. The nets sagged, the lines blurred, and within minutes, the courts looked less like a place for weekend matches and more like the bottom of a pond. And then the houses. 3 of them, side by side, brand new builds with those clean white siding panels and big basement windows that probably seemed like a great feature when the weather was nice. I watched as the water reached the window wells, filled them, hesitated for just a second, then slipped inside like it had been waiting for permission. That's when the real chaos started. People running outside in the rain, some with umbrellas, most without, shouting to each other, pointing, trying to figure out what was happening and how to stop it. One guy, mid-40s maybe, soaked through his shirt, kept gesturing toward the pond like yelling at it might make a difference. It didn't. Water doesn't negotiate. By the time the storm began to ease, the damage was already done. The pond was overflowing, the courts were flooded, and those basements. I didn't need to go inside to know they were ruined. You could see it in the way people stood outside their homes, hands on their heads, staring at something they couldn't undo. I stayed on my porch until the rain slowed to a drizzle, then finally stopped. The air felt different after that, quieter, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. I figured it wouldn't take long. I was right. Next morning, just after sunrise, I heard engines coming up the dirt road. Not 1-3. Black SUVs, clean and out of place against the mud and gravel, pulling up near my gate like they owned the view. Doors opened, and out stepped a small group of people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else but here. At the front was Richard, same pressed shirt, same controlled expression, but there was something tighter around his eyes now, something less polished. He didn't wait for an invitation, just walked straight up to the fence, shoes already picking up mud. "Mr. Turner," he called out, voice louder than it needed to be. "We need to talk." I took my time walking over, not slow enough to be disrespectful, just not rushed either. "Morning, Richard," I said, stopping a few feet back from the fence. "Rough night." His jaw flexed slightly. You obstructed a drainage outlet. I glanced over my shoulder at the berm, then back at him. I secured my property. That pipe is part of an engineered system, he snapped, some of that smooth tone finally cracking. You've caused significant damage. I tilted my head a little. Funny, that's exactly what I was thinking when I found it. One of the other board members, a woman in a raincoat that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill, stepped forward. You need to remove that obstruction immediately, she said, voice sharp, controlled, like she was used to being listened to. Or we will pursue legal action. I nodded slowly, like I was considering it. Then I pointed down at the ground between us, right where the fence line ran. This is my property, I said, calm, steady. That pipe crosses onto it without permission, without an easement, without so much as a conversation. You don't get to tell me what I can or can't do on my land. Richard took a step closer, lowering his voice. You're making this worse than it needs to be. I met his gaze. No, I'm making it stop. For a moment, nobody said anything. Just the sound of water dripping from the trees, the distant hum of pumps starting up somewhere in the subdivision. Then he straightened, adjusted his sleeves like he was putting his composure back on. This isn't over, he said. I know, I replied. That's kind of the point. They left not long after that, tires spinning a little as they turned around, mud clinging to those clean black vehicles like a reminder of where they'd been. 2 days later, the county inspector finally showed up. His name was Alvarez, older guy, sun-worn face, the kind of presence that doesn't need to announce itself. He walked the property with me, didn't say much at first, just took notes, looked at the pipe, the berm, the watermarks still visible on both sides of the fence. When we reached the pipe, he stopped for a long moment, hands on his hips. This new, he asked. Couple weeks, maybe less, I said. He nodded once, then pulled out a folder, flipped through some documents, frowning slightly. I'm not seeing any permits filed for this installation, he muttered. I didn't say anything. He looked up at me. They didn't get approval for this. Nope. Another pause. Then he exhaled, slow, like he'd just confirmed something he already suspected. That's a problem for them. And just like that, the whole situation shifted. What followed wasn't loud or dramatic. No courtroom scenes, no big speeches. Just paperwork, inspections, and a series of very expensive corrections. The HOA had to bring in emergency pumps to deal with the standing water, crews working around the clock to drain what they could and prevent further damage. Then came the real cost, redesigning their entire drainage system, rerouting everything back onto their own property where it should have been in the first place. I heard the number through Hank a week later, somewhere in the six-figure range. He just shook his head when he told me, half impressed, half amused. Expensive lesson, he said. Yeah, I replied, watching my pasture slowly come back to life as the last of the water drained away. But a necessary one. It took time, a few weeks for the ground to firm up again, a couple more for the grass to start pushing through, stubborn as ever. The horses returned to that lower field like they'd never left, grazing like nothing had happened, which in a way felt like the best kind of ending. The barn stayed dry. That mattered more than anything. As for Brookstone Ridge, they fixed their problem, sure. New drainage, properly contained, no more shortcuts. But you can still see the aftermath if you know where to look. The tennis courts have these faint cracks running through them now, like scars that didn't quite heal right. And those 3 houses. I've heard the basements were gutted and redone, but water has a way of leaving a memory behind, even after it's gone. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I stand out by the fence and look up at that neighborhood. Lights on, people going about their lives, everything back to looking the way it's supposed to. And I think about how close I came to just accepting it, filing the complaint, waiting my turn, letting my land take the hit because it was easier. But here's the thing, easy doesn't mean right. They made a decision, thinking it wouldn't come back to them. All I did was return it. So now I'm curious. If you were standing where I was, watching your land turn into someone else's dumping ground, would you have blocked that pipe like I did? Or would you have let it happen and trusted the system to fix it eventually? Let me know what you think, because depending on who you ask, I'm either the guy who protected his property or the one who flooded 3 homes. And honestly, I've heard both.